man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he ordered Lenny to come in until the day that Lenny died. He said, you go with and then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the mistake the best the world.
주체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 군님 백성의 영도 따라서 전군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성애국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 물건의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 만나려 한다. 선진 기업의 승리하여 너의 범극적 의미에 불러 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
만큼 덕샷 마사 가스대력 여사요무사 가슴빛 이보셀 잡사 단체주작요무사 언질린 헌치세 어지민 헌치세 내대군이 조스대공궁 내림지마들 올려무쇼 세증날 취대리 흥가들이 제진나랑 함타대리 셀잘로 흥나메라보게 세리어서 동승용사 먼지링 헌치세 어지민 헌치세 내대군이 조스대공궁 내림지마들 공룡시 Angna chamag mete hurher Ayodi hureg darim garhat Kulgin tore gatar hurve Kulni som toskar basinsa 언질링 헌치세 어떠지민 헌치세 내대군이 소스대공궁 내림지 바다를 흘려오시오 Vargin helhet doragui
Ayagel moçargui Yagdnegen altim terekçi Yaltim daragette botsima Onancidi onçise Cimin hatisem Neşte bunyi Sosne kovum Nerinci Akar koyuşum
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 7th of March, 2025, and here we are with a live stream dealing with the consequences of Monsieur Macron and Monsieur Trump. So we will be looking at recent speeches given by a certain wannabe Napoleon and a certain wannabe William McKinley, apparently, who was a great president, wonderful guy. That terrible assassin robbed us of the greatest president the world had ever seen. Quite why Trump is obsessed with the William McKinley period is something worthy of discussion. So we will be returning to that later on. But first of all, we will be getting into the latest events from Syria, the obedient running to the call of the piper of all the political rats in Britain, of which there are plenty, including amongst them a certain Mr. Farage. And then we will get into Macron and then Trump. But first of all, we will greet those who are in the chat thus far. So we have Victor, Tom Wolf, Robson from Indonesia, Tracy, Carter Mann, who asked for more China content. Duly noted. We'll see what we can do. Jerry, Muzzle Paint, Tim Gray, Jason, good evening to you, comrade. Yeah. China's space agency doing better than the American one at the moment. At least they don't have two people still stranded up in the space station. I believe they're still there. Europe committed to spend €1 trillion on defense. Well, we'll see where that goes when we come to Macron's speech. Hello to Mo1917, to Abtin. Juan says Brussels could be turned into a psychiatric hospital. Only the doctors are needed. The patients are already there. Indeed. Agricola Urbanus joins us from Berlin Mitte. Good evening to Comrade Davy and to Caustic Grip. And Zauter says Europe spending €1 trillion on defense would buy less than 50 million euros equivalent renminbi spent by the PRC, which is a good point. The procurement systems of the European countries and Britain are hideously wasteful by their very nature. Money leaks out of them like water through a sieve. So they may spend $1 trillion and get absolutely nothing or very little for it. This is what will probably happen in the British case, because in the British case, the defence companies, as the Ministry of Defence has even admitted when it comes to their spending on the nuclear submarine program, the companies they used to fulfill the contract are very wasteful and routinely and massively overcharge for the work that they do. And yet the Ministry of Defence keeps on using them anyway. Even Sten, Zauter says further, the USA produces one nuclear attack sub every 4 years. The People's Republic of China produces one every 4 months. Yes. Agricola says this whole militarization is a joke. They want to destroy welfare and lift the debt brake at the same time. Europe can do nothing against Russia, not in a decade. Well, the thing is, they don't expect to actually have to fight Russia. Not really. They don't actually believe that. We will get to why in just a moment. Hello to Vera and to James Goblin from the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Hello to Panama Lewis. Hello to who else? We got Luca and Dave C, Comrade Kate. Hello to Alison M. Hello to Bob Parr. Hello to Will Johnson. Okay. So we begin with a look at what's going on in Syria. Now, there appears to have been in the west of Syria something of an uprising by the Alawite population, which, of course, was the part of the basis on which the Assad-led government was established. The Assad's father, and of course Bashar al-Assad himself, came from the Alawite minority, and the mercenaries, the jihadist mercenaries, who are sectarian, reactionary, lumpen scum, I think that's the best way to describe them, target the Alawite minority. Now, what's been happening is an escalation of tension since the collapse, or I should say, implosion of the Assad-led Ba'athist government back in late November of last year, when within a few days of fighting commencing in a way that no one apparently expected, the Assad government completely imploded. What happened, as has been now, I think, comprehensively proved, is that a lot of the hierarchy of the Assad government had gone rotten and simply switched sides. And they switched sides under the influence of the Gulf states. And the HTS force was quite minimal, could have been beaten, but the Syrian state had apparently, following years of siege by the imperialists and civil war, and the civil war that was fueled by the Obama administration, the Cameron government here, the Hollande and then Macron governments in France, the state got hollowed out by years of sanctions, civil war, and corruption that followed from that, and then fell to pieces very quickly. And Assad was left as a man ruling nothing, essentially. So, but this collapse left many, many millions of Syrians essentially bereft and adrift. And so resistance has emerged quite quickly from key cadres of the Syrian Arab army, and who are now going up against HTS forces in the Alawite areas. And HTS, in reality, HTS is just a sort of umbrella name for an entity that is more correctly described as a NATO-sponsored mercenary army. Now, if you look at the likes of Jalani, the so-called president of the new Syria, in reality, a re-establishment of neo-colonial Syria with local powers such as the Turks and the Israeli regime playing the role of the active enforcers on the ground. The way in which that has been reconstructed shows clearly what the agenda was here. But the HTS-led regime, in reality, a regime of mercenaries, as I said, bought and paid for by the West, has been bombing Alawite areas with barrel bombs, no less. Funny how the great defenders of human rights don't want to mention that, because, of course, it was never about barrel bombs. It was never about human rights. It was never about Assad being a dictator. It was about the fact that the Ba'athist government stood in the way of certain objectives that the imperialists had, and therefore it had to be destroyed. And just the same way as Libya was destroyed, just the same way as Iraq was destroyed, just the same way they would like to destroy Iran, but so far, mercifully, they have not been able to. Now, what we've seen since the coming to power of HTS is that the regime is as bitter and sectarian as we thought it was, and also that it is a pure puppet of the West and its regional managers, Turkey and Israel, in that they don't resist Israel when it takes over large areas of southern Syria. They don't resist Turkey, of course, who's looking to seize large areas of the north. They, of course, have no intention of making the US leave the areas of the far north, but that might be a source of tension given the US's role in backing the Kurds. And, of course, the Kurds are still in bitter dispute with not just the Erdogan regime in Ankara, but what you might call the Turkish permanent bureaucracy, which has a virulent loathing of the Kurdish population, and hence any organization of theirs is something the Turkish permanent bureaucracy cannot tolerate. So that might create some problems, but the problems for them at the moment come in the form of the Alawite resistance movement, which has been fighting the HTS forces on the ground in Western Syria for the last few days. And of course, the HTS, or in reality, /Al Qaeda /ISIS, these are all one entity in reality, has been responding in the way that is absolutely typical of all Western mercenary armies, which is mass executions, beheadings, torture, rapes, you name it. It's basically a standard practice for any Western neo-colonial force of mercenaries. They behave pretty much the same way the Israelis do, because this is how imperialism enforces its will. The reality of so-called Western values, and we'll get to Monsieur Macron's feelings about Western values in just a moment. This is the reality of them, that there is two fists to the Western approach to things. There's the soft power angle, which is all about the more subtle game of influencing and intelligence operations and persuasion operations, and to hollow out governments and states via more subtle methods. But when that doesn't work, then you've got the more unsubtle methods. Then you have an ISIS, then you have an Al Qaeda, then you have an HTS, then you have Banderites or other Ukrainian fascists or Russian fascists, or go back 40 years ago, Contras in Nicaragua. Go back years before that, the death squads of the South Vietnamese regime, of course, trained and brought up to a level of psychopathy by the CIA. Go back before that, if we go back all the way to World War II, what do you have? In the case of the Germans, you have SS, Einsatzgruppen. This is all basically the same kind of tactic, which is rule by terror and fear, rule by intimidation and fear of what will happen to you if you dare so much as lift a finger against the occupation forces or the neo-colonial forces. This is what HTS in reality is. It's what Al-Qaeda is. It's what ISIS is. These are all mercenary armies fulfilling the same role that these forces have always fulfilled for the imperialists, that of the strong-arm merchants, the torturers, the murderers, the executioners. That is who HTS are. And that is who the great bulk of the Western left were actually supporting for years. Now, they will, of course, fervently deny this, but it is my contention, and I will repeat it here, that the failure to do anything significant to oppose the imperialist plans for Libya and Syria is one of the most damning failures of the Western left in recent years. And that's saying a lot. Though, of course, if I use the term failure, that would imply they ever intended to succeed in the first place. What they effectively did, though, was they divided, confused, demoralized, led astray any anti-war sentiment. The only anti-war demonstration that they held against the US intervention, US-led intervention against Libya, was a demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in support of said military intervention in reality. When it comes to Syria, they nominally opposed the bombing, but of course would issue all kinds of statements saying that they agreed with the imperialists about how terrible Assad was. Well, it turns out the Ba'athist government, for all of its numerous flaws, of which there undoubtedly were many, was at least a civilized, secular regime that tried to keep the territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence of the country together, and tried to have the various different religious groupings and ethnic groupings inside Syria live in relative harmony. Didn't succeed in that ultimately, but that is what they were trying to do, or part of what they were trying to do. The imperialists, of course, have imposed the rule of a vicious, backward-looking, reactionary, sectarian lumpen scum who are behaving as these people always do, because that's who the imperialists always rely on, as I have already said. So what a great triumph for the Western Marxists. They have their moment of joy, their moment of victory. I'm sure Yanis Varoufakis, Paul Mason, and all the others are all celebrating tonight. Another great victory for the amazing anti-war work that Western Marxists engage in. Basically, what we have to extract from all of this is that if you're not prepared to go all in on opposing imperialism at home, where you can best oppose it, if you're not prepared to actually take some risks in building an anti-war movement, and even if that risk is just people being mean to you in the newspapers, people saying that you back dictators, if you're not even prepared to endure the abuse of the bourgeois press, then you have no business calling yourself a Marxist, never mind any kind of revolutionary. But for most of the British left, they couldn't endure even bad words being said about them in The Guardian. This is how weak and feeble and treacherous these people really are. So the resistance in Syria will continue. We should support any attempt to overthrow the mercenary army that now rules Syria and their wretched scumbag paymaster who sits in Ankara and the other one who sits in Tel Aviv, both of whom ultimately work for the US imperialists themselves. But the role of the Erdogan regime cannot be overstated. It is participating directly in the repression of the Syrians who are resisting HTS right now. The Erdogan regime is one of the most backward, corrupt, reactionary regimes to have ever ruled Turkey, and that's really saying something, given some of the characters they've had in power there before. But the Erdogan regime is a particularly obnoxious, offensive, and hypocritical manifestation of the reactionary Islamic forces that exist across West Asia. And it does this, of course, whilst speaking the language of Islamic Brotherhood and we will pray in Al-Quds and all that kind of stuff. In reality, they are in business with the imperialists. They do the bidding of the imperialists. They provide mercenaries for the imperialists, and they are allied with Israel. That's the truth about Erdogan, and he's proving that over and over again by his actions in Syria. So keep an eye on the situation in Syria. There is not only are there horrendous crimes being committed there, but there is real resistance that has broken out there. And it's real. The truth of that resistance must be brought out to a Western audience, which is, like mushrooms, kept in the dark and fed shit most of the time, as we will see as we go through the agenda here today. So we now move on to talk about a certain Mr. Nigel Farage. If you're not familiar with him, Nigel Farage is the leader of the so-called Reform Party, and here we go. I'm just going to pull up his tweet now. Now, Farage is an interesting figure. For many years, he has played the game of pretending to be oppositional, but in reality, of course, that is not the case. In reality, Farage is a stooge. He is a fake oppositional figure. He is, of course, he belongs to a certain faction in the ruling class, and when that certain faction in the ruling class cracks the whip, Nigel, like an obedient rat, springs up on his hind legs and begs for attention. And indeed, he has done this over and over again, and he has done it and displayed who he really is most recently, that is today. So, Farage, in the not too distant past, made a big show of opposing certain efforts of the EU to expand into Ukraine. And as you can see from this tweet, I will just pull this up here. Yep, there we go. You can see here that he has gone from criticizing attempts to bring Ukraine into the EU and NATO and in recent weeks was calling Ukraine a deeply corrupt country and was kind of mirroring Trump's language a little bit. Now, though, he has done a backflip and he has now said that, as you can see on the screen, the breakdown in talks and aid between the US and Ukraine only helps Putin. I hope Keir Starmer can use his new role to bring the two together, and soon. So there you have it. What you are witnessing here, and I was talking about this when it comes to the wretched Social Democrats last week. What we're witnessing here is the fact that the British ruling class are doing again, I'll use the Americanism, a full court press against any opposition to their line on the Ukraine war. They've been doing this for years. They've been doing this since 2022. And it was noticeable immediately that the ruling class had essentially declared through their various networks that no dissent would be permitted. Certainly no dissent would be permitted inside what is, to use Jürgen Habermas's old term, inside the bourgeois public sphere. Meaning no dissent permitted in Parliament, which is why all of the parties in the British Parliament are 100% lined up behind the government's policy, from the so-called Scottish nationalists to the Welsh nationalists to the Liberals, of course, the Tories who began the policy in the first place, the Labour Party who were all on board with it. And they are all lined up behind the policy as stated by Keir Starmer. And the real, which is that they want peace talks on Ukraine's terms. But of course, they aren't Ukraine's terms that Zelensky's reading out. They are the terms given to him by London, by the intelligence men in London, to a slightly lesser extent, Paris as well. We will get to Macron, as I said, in just a moment. So, why has Farage done a backflip? He's done a backflip because, again, this is who he has always been. He speaks for a section of the ruling class. He always has. But the entire ruling class, whether they're pro or anti-Brexit, are all absolutely lined up behind the plan to defeat, divide, and destroy the Russian Federation. All of them. There's no dissenting voice within the ruling class. There's no split in the ruling class. As I have said many times, they are more unified over the need for a war on Russia than they are over even something like Israel. There's a lot of repression going on over Israel because the movement against the Israeli genocidal war on Gaza has been so big. It's disturbed the ruling class. There's far less of any dissent over the Ukraine war, so they haven't really felt the need to do that much repression because everybody's fallen into line. Every political force, all the trade unions, everybody is all 100% behind this. It is a direct confirmation of everything that Marxist-Leninists have been saying about how politics is organized in imperialist countries, which is that all of these political actors that you see on the stage, they all represent a certain one faction of the ruling class or another. And when the entire ruling class unites, all of the political factions unite. So there's Nigel towing the line of Keir Starmer, a man who he claims is a disaster, is a man leading Britain down the toilet, is a man who cannot be trusted. But funny thing is, when it comes to a question of war and peace, apparently Nigel's ready to trust Sir Keir. So isn't that funny? Isn't that funny that Nigel Farage will say all day and all night that Keir Starmer is a liar, that he can't be trusted, that he's running a two-tier justice system directed against white people? Nigel won't say that, but that's what he's implying. That Sir Keir is ruining Britain, that he's turning it into a Bolshevik nightmare. But on the fundamental questions of war, Sir Keir is to be backed 100%, because Nigel's had a talking to, clearly, from his friends in the ruling class who have said, look, Nigel, old boy, we like this whole roguish devil with a skin like creosote act you're putting on. Very good. Brings in a lot of the plebs, and that's valuable, but no funny business over this Ukraine game, okay? And Nigel got the call, and Nigel has fallen into line. And I'm really glad that he has, because what all of these political forces, from the SNP to the Greens, of course, let's not forget them, see yesterday's program about their wretched statement on Ukraine, to Reform, to the Welsh nationalists, what they've all revealed is that none of them are an oppositional force. Not really. Not when it comes to anything fundamental. Over fringe issues, over issues the ruling class has no real interest in or cares about, they'll make a big noise. When it comes to something really fundamental, they will obediently toe the line, because no dissent can be allowed inside the political system. And again, I welcome this. I welcome Nigel coming out and backing Keir Starmer, because what it will do is it will basically expose him in front of at least a significant minority of people who might have voted for him. Because there is a chunk of the population that sees through the Ukraine war and thinks that by voting for Farage, they can get their own version of Trump in. Now, about Trump, more in just a moment. Now, he's just revealed that he is essentially a slave, a well-paid servant, I should say, of a certain faction in the ruling class that wants the war to continue. And so this is important because it reveals that there is no opposition inside the system, because no opposition is allowed. The only thing you're allowed to disagree about in the bourgeois system right now, again, is over fringe stuff. You're allowed to do cultural signaling. You're allowed to do stuff about aesthetics. You're allowed to, there's something of a split in the ruling class over certain cultural issues that they're prepared to allow those to be argued about. But over something as fundamental as this, no dissent is allowed. And Nigel's flip-flopping on the issue shows clearly where he aligns himself. It's the same place as all the others. And it's a tacit acknowledgement as well from Farage and all the others that it is that funding anything in the British system is dependent upon the profits reaped by the rapacious zombie known as British imperialism, which continues to stagger on, groaning brains as it seeks to feast on new victims. And without the blood of new victims, the wheels of the system cannot be oiled. And if the wheels of the system can't be oiled, then nothing that the Farages, the Starmers, the Badenocks, the Davies, the Swinneys, the Ramsays from the Green Party promise can be delivered. So all of these people are looking to run the British imperial system. The British imperialist system is what they aspire to lead, whether they say that's what they want to do or not. Or in the case of Swinney and the Green and the SNP and Plaid Cymru, they aspire to be the system's representatives in Scotland and Wales. That's what they aspire to be. There's just, I mean, I've already talked about this on the Social Democrats, social chauvinists episode. But for the likes of the Welsh nationalists and the SNP, what they want is to be the well-remunerated servants of the ruling class. They don't want independence. They don't want to engage in the difficult and dangerous work of actually having to run a country. They want to be the duly designated, appointed men who will essentially oversee the decline and further collapse into poverty of Scotland and Wales, because that's what devolution was meant to do. That's why it was designed that way by Blair and others, or people who worked for Blair. And essentially, this is the devil's bargain that the Welsh and the Plaid Cymru and the SNP have struck. And it's the same devil's bargain that the Green Party have struck in England, which is you don't oppose the ruling class over anything fundamental, and you get a well-remunerated career and a good pension out of it. This is the game. And Nigel's in on the game. He's been on the game for years. Fake oppositionist that always falls into line when it matters. Just as he fell into line back in 2019 when he withdrew the Brexit Party candidates that were standing against the Tories to maximise the numbers by which Boris Johnson's Tories would win and make sure that Corbyn was relegated to the wilderness. And of course, Corbyn had already relegated himself to the wilderness by the contradictions in his own useless reformist politics. But the ruling class wanted to make sure that Corbyn was buried. Why? So that the hope of anything different, even the mild delusions of revived social democracy, that was buried. And it's what they've been making sure of over the last decade, the British ruling class, that there is no way to reform the system. Now, of course, there isn't. And Marxist-Leninists knows damn well that in their own way, the ruling class are expressing a certain truth, which is you can't reform this system. Now, Nigel Farage knows that. He has no intention of reforming it. He's just going to do a lot of virtue signalling and tub-thumping anti-immigrant rhetoric. And in reality, he's going to carry on with roughly the same policies, but with more of a Doge twist, perhaps, these days. Now, the problem is that Farage has been successfully sold to large elements in the petty bourgeoisie and the working class as the change candidate. And the problem in Britain, and as is the same problem in the United States, is that because so many people have had wishes for some kind of profound change so utterly crushed over the last decade and a half, that we've reached a point where certain sections of the working class, and certainly quite a lot of the petty bourgeoisie, now are just looking for some change, any change, even if it only has the appearance of a dramatic change, like what Trump is engaging in right now. And Farage is looking to provide that same service, which is he's going to provide the illusion of change, the theatre of change, the aesthetics of change, without actually doing much to change anything at all. A lot of rhetoric, a lot of jumping up and down, a lot of screaming about re-establishing Britain, and basically then carrying on with roughly the same policies that Starmer and Sunak would have done, because the ruling class will not allow any deviation. And in doing so, this gets to the point about why I'm glad that they've been this hardline and they've done this, because they're just revealing the farce that is bourgeois democracy. Because the ruling class declares that you will all follow our line, and all of these supposedly disparate political forces go, yes, sir, and they issue the same statements on Ukraine, almost word for word with each other. So there's anybody with eyes to see this can see what's going on. There's no such thing as the as so-called democracy. There is a bourgeois democracy, which the increasing numbers of the working class see through, and they see through it by dint of the fact that they're just not voting anymore and aren't investing in it anymore. Those who are still invested in it to a degree are going to vote for reform, and reform will get in, and the situation will get worse, and things will continue to degenerate. And this presents us with something of a fundamental problem for us in the West, which is that because we went through this long period, or relatively long period, of social democratic reform, we have, as I've mentioned before, large numbers of people who, whether they vote for social democrats or nominally right-wing parties or nominally left-wing parties, they're all looking to get back to a period of welfare capitalism of some description or another. Whether they know that's what they want or not, this is what you dig into the research into, like, what the bulk of the views are amongst the working class and even large sections of the middle class in Britain, the petty bourgeoisie. And what you find is generally you have a broadly social democratic consciousness still amongst many of them, which is that they support things like nationalization of key industries, they support the continuation of the National Health Service, they support progressive taxation, at least most of them do. They don't like bankers, they don't like landlords very much, and they generally want society to be a little bit fairer. That's been consistently demonstrated in opinion polls going all the way back to the 1980s. Now, so then why don't they get any of those things? Well, because anybody who offers any of that in a sincere way is immediately kiboshed by his own party, in the case of the Labour Party, or never gets near winning due to various shenanigans played by the ruling class and their media, or that the people who say they want that, but because they don't see any party offering it in a convincing way, they end up voting for something which offers none of those things. They end up voting for something like the Tories or Reform simply on the basis of their fact that they hate the other parties so much. I've been on the doorsteps, done the door knocking, and what you find is people say they're going to vote like it was UKIP back in the day, now Reform, for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with the actual platform Reform is standing on. It's just a general feeling that they'll be different. Because, as I said, when it comes to ourselves in Britain, or the French, or the Germans, or the Americans, everybody, or large numbers of people, I should say, feel stuck and frustrated, and they're falling into despair. And so they grasp at anything which looks like it might be a change, now that all the political projects which painted themselves, at least, as progressive changes, have all hit the rocks and sank. So now those people who still are desperate for some change, any change, to get out of what they feel is a stultifying and suffocating system, which it is, they grasp at anything. They grasp at Trump, Farage, Le Pen, Meloni, the AfD, all of which will, of course, turn out to be exactly what we have always said they are, which is various tools of the ruling class who will toe the same line. And so we continue. And here I'll get to finish on this point about the piss poor nature and weak nature of working class organization now. The problem that the crisis facing us right now is a crisis of the leadership of the working class. What do I mean by that? The leadership of the working class organizations, such as they are in this country, and I'm talking mainly about the trade unions, in terms of the senior leaders, the national executive councils or committees, and the bureaucracies, dominated by like Labour Party left wingers, Labour Party right wingers, Communist Party of Britain people, all of whom are, if I was being charitable, I would describe them as pessimists. I would describe them as people who have no faith in the masses whatsoever. And this reflects in their politics. And the politics of these people is always that all that they are prepared to do, all that they believe they can do, is to secure a slightly less worse defeat. That's the whole strategy of the British trade union leadership. Even the ones who are supposedly left-wing, even the ones who are supposedly radical, what they're looking for is not a victory, it's a slightly less worse defeat, which the ruling class will give to you if you put on a good show. And as long as that remains the case, as long as the working class organizations remain in the hands of like the fake communists, the Trotskyites, and the labor leftists and labor rightists, this is all we're going to get. We're going to go through another generation of just the entire vision of the working class organizations being that we will lose slightly less badly. That's it. And then you wonder why the younger generation doesn't join trade unions. You wonder why the younger generation wants nothing to do with it. Because why would you just want to pay your money into something that promises a slightly less bad defeat? And it's why you have like this stultifying, suffocating pessimism hanging over everything. Because the mentality of so many people, and when I make criticisms of other people, I am also leveling them at myself and mistakes that I have made in the past. Because whether we knew it or not 10 years ago, all of us were running around the idea of that there was going to be some kind of attempt to revive social democracy. It just isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen. Doesn't matter which part of the country that you're in. There will be no revival of social democracy. And there will be no revival of the old mass social democratic parties, the old mass trade unions, because quite simply put, these entities are too rotten for it at the moment. There will, of course, be class struggle. There always is. That's just like the gravitational forces moving the world around. That will not and cannot stop, because class warfare is being waged constantly by the ruling class on the working class, and the working class will find ways to fight back. The problem at the moment is that the agents of the ruling class control all the avenues through which fightbacks can be traditionally established. But the working class will find a way. And until the layer of traitors, sellouts, pessimists, and utterly useless wankers is pushed out of the way, or at least rendered irrelevant by events, then all we're going to be doing is talking about how we can lose less bad. Because again, the vision of the leadership of the working class is all wrong. Because the vision of all of these leaders is just to revive social democracy. And we've had 17 years now since the economic crash of 2008. And where's the revived social democracy? Where is it in Greece? Where is it in Germany? Where is it in Italy? Where is it in France? Where is it in Britain? Where is it in the United States? It's all died. All the experiments that people were getting, that we were all, in one form or another, were getting excited about a decade ago. It's all hit the rocks. They've all been sunk by the ruling class, or they've sunk themselves due to the fact that they couldn't handle the political situation they were in, which required the launching of a very real and potentially dangerous fight against the ruling class. And Nigel Farage isn't up for that fight any more than the TUC leaders, or the leaders of the Trotskyite organizations, or the leaders of the so-called anti-war movement, or the leaders of the fake Communist Party are. There just simply isn't anybody in the leadership of the so-called working class organizations, or even other wider bourgeois political organizations, that actually wants to engage in a serious fight with the ruling class at the moment. And so you just get people falling into despair who still want to believe that there is some way back within the system. And it is our job as communists to use Lenin's phrase, to patiently explain why there is no way back through the system. There will not be. There's no way back to social democracy. There's no way to make Brexit work under capitalism. These things are fantasies. The ruling class has its fantasies and its delusions like any other class. They're not clear-eyed realists. They understand their interests, but they don't understand how best to secure them, because many of them don't properly understand their own system. Again, we will get to Mr. Trump in just a moment. But the job of our job now as communists is to reach those workers who are realizing some of the things that I've been talking about tonight, who are starting to ask questions, who realize that the system is not only working against them, but will never work for them no matter what. And it is to find those workers and to recruit them to our parties and to politically educate them and to get ready for the further degeneration and disintegration of the system, and for the breaking out of class struggle right out into the open. Because what will happen is, in all of the imperialist countries, it doesn't matter which one we're talking about here, it could be any of the Western European countries, could be this country, could be the United States. Life for the working class, whether it's under the rotten social democracy of Keir Starmer or under the right-wing so-called populism of Donald Trump, life of the working class will continue to get worse. It will continue to get worse at a rapidly increasing rate. And when that happens, the class struggle will break out into the open. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean wildcat strikes. I mean struggles over taxation. So, for instance, in local government in Britain, they're jacking up taxes locally all the time on people who are already stretched or already penniless and giving them nothing back for it in return in the form of services. So the legitimacy of the system, which is just going to be taxing people more and more and more and giving them less and less and less, the legitimacy of the system really since 1945 has been based on the idea that at least you got something for your taxes, that at least there was some element of security provided to you. Now that's all being withdrawn. The legitimacy of these systems is going to start to crumble, and we need to be there organizing in the working class for when those moments arrive. So patient and diligent work is needed in the time ahead. So we will now move to the rabid, I should say, delusions of a certain Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, who has been spouting off recently about how he's going to lead Europe. This is a chronic delusion that Monsieur Macron has suffered from for quite some time. He thinks he's Napoleon. Now, they used to throw you in the insane asylum for sticking your hand in your coat and wearing a big hat and declaring yourself to be Napoleon. But apparently these days they just make you president of France. Now, Macron gave an interesting speech recently, interesting in terms of its absolutely wild delusions about how the US was separating from Europe and imposing unjust tariffs. And therefore it was down to him, Monsieur Macron, to lead Europe out of the darkness, because he is the savior. He is Jeanne d'Arc. He is the revived Eric Cantona. He is the hero of France. He is Charles de Gaulle's hat reborn. And I am only exaggerating slightly. It's clearly that is how he sees himself. And it was an interesting speech because it was as much directed at the United States as it was against the Russians. Now, Macron told a series of lies about the Ukraine war that I won't bother to go into for now, the usual standard stuff about Russian aggression. But the interesting thing was that Macron declared that France would lead a unified Europe to defend itself against the Russians. Now, what does that actually mean? Macron claimed that the Russians are coming for all of Europe. Now, that's not true. Not only is it the case that the Russians don't need to invade Europe, they have no desire to invade Europe, the Russian ruling class didn't even want to actually carry out the special military operation against Ukraine. And they don't have the manpower to invade and occupy Europe. So why is it that the Europeans are all trying to saying they're going to militarize? Why is Macron portraying himself as like the new Napoleon, who's going to unify all of Europe and march on Moscow? Why is the fool who runs Poland, Donald Tusk, is talking about bringing in conscription for Polish men? Why are they doing this? What is it really about? And the truth about it is it's twofold. One is that the tensions within the imperialist bloc are actually boiling away. They are reaching a new level. Now, there are multiple interpretations of the way in which Trump has gone about implementing the new tactics of US imperialism. Some have mistakenly declared that it is the Great Revolution, that Trump is Jefferson reborn, that he's remaking the Republic, swinging a sword through the bureaucracies and restoring the Republic before the dreadful mistakes of the 20th century. That's the delusions of a Scott Ritter, for instance. Now, there's another point of view, which I think is maybe a little bit more realistic, but also suffers from some delusions of its own, which is the point of view of the likes of Brian Berletich and others, who insist that nothing's actually changed, or it is just purely a changing tactics, and that the Machiavellian schemes of the US and others are being aligned again, and this whole public dispute is just a wrestling match. It's just a dog and pony show. Now, I am opposed to both points of view, and I will explain why. I think that those who declare that Trump is getting out of the regime change business and getting out of the imperialism business are foolish in the extreme, because Trump's saying openly that he's not doing that. Trump has already reestablished effective US control over the Panama Canal in an act of gross imperialism. He's declaring he wants to absorb Greenland. He appears to be quite serious about this. I mean, I thought for a moment that he was just after mineral rights and concessions over US bases there, but they've already got the right to have US bases there. They've had US bases there before. It would appear that Trump is out to gain total control over the mineral rights in Greenland at the very least, and total control over the shipping lanes. I'm still in doubt whether the US ruling class wants to get into the business of adding states to the Union. That might trigger too many problems, but Trump is apparently sold on the idea. I don't think they're going to go through with it. I think a lot of what stuff that Trump says is going to hit the buffers pretty soon, but we will continue with Macron. Now, what's actually going on is that the tensions between the US and the European powers that have always been there from 1945, when the US reconstituted West Germany and put France back on its feet, rebuilt to a certain degree the industrial base of Italy, propped up the British for the purpose of aligning them against the USSR and stopping working class revolutions in these countries. There's always been tensions that exist between them. The displays of unity that they put on for NATO conferences, etc., are always for the cameras. Behind the scenes, there's always disputes, there's always rows, there's always tension between them. They were unified against the fear of working class revolution in their own countries. That's what held them together for so long. With that threat, they think, gone after 1990, the tensions between them continued to escalate. They've held together largely out of a shared interest in pillaging certain countries. But now the US is diverting itself into or changing tactics in terms of making the war against Russia less costly and having to reorganize themselves internally to try and get themselves in a position where they can go up against the Chinese, they think, and stand an expectation, a decent chance of winning. They are reorganizing the Ukraine war to the horror of the Europeans. Now, the horror is real, the freak out is real, the dispute is real, but it doesn't mean the US is leaving Europe. That's an exaggeration. The freak out of the Europeans is based on the fact that some of them, maybe not Macron, but some of them in France and in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Britain even, some of them understand that without American military power, they can't enforce their property rights, shall we say, their claims in other places in the world. Look at how humiliating a retreat that the French had to beat out of like Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso and now Senegal. The local population demanded that they leave, the governments demanded that they leave, and the French had to pack up sticks and go away because they couldn't hope to win a war against a unified and determined population. And they wouldn't stand much of a chance because they relied largely on proxy forces to do their enforcing work in these countries. So the French are in a weakened state and are feeling like that without the US to back them up, they'll lose control over much of the rest of their neo-colonial extended empire. And so this is a great worry for them. And without US backing, there can be no hope of continuing the war as it currently stands against the Russians. The US clearly hopes that the Europeans will be able to keep it going for a while they reorganize themselves. That's a delusion. Just as Macron's idea of France leading a unified Europe is a delusion. Europe is not only not unified, it will become ever more split as time goes on. the idea of issuing these euro war bonds to pay for a remilitarization effort, which the French will lead, this is going to lead to confrontations in Europe itself. Between the French and the Germans, the French and the Italians. The British stand outside the EU but still want to influence military and diplomatic affairs within it. They're all going to continue to fall out with each other because they're all in crisis. Now, they have bought into this idea that if they manage to secure a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine, manage to get some kind of European military presence in there with guarantees put in place by the US, that they can then spend 5-6 years remilitarizing Ukraine, rebuilding its armed forces again, then hurling the Ukrainians again against the Russians in a few years' time. That's the plan. So when Starmer and Macron talk about sending troops to Ukraine, that's what they mean. They don't mean to do much fighting. They mean to control what is left of Bandera-run Ukraine and to preserve the Kiev regime, to prop that up. That's what they mean to do. And then to spend time rebuilding its military and then get it ready for usage again. That's what the plan is. As Starmer himself said in the British Parliament this week, they don't want an open war with the Russians. They don't want an open war with the Russians because they know that they absolutely cannot win. So Macron's gibbering away about France will protect Europe. I mean, he says France has the biggest army. Well, Le Grand Armée, it certainly is not anymore, but it is probably the best equipped, best trained, and largest amongst the Europeans, other than the army that is controlled by the Turks, of course. But can it take on the Russians? Absolutely no chance. Absolutely no chance. The Russians now have, between 800,000 to 1 million men at their disposal around the theatre of war. They have an air defense system which covers all of Ukraine, against which the European air forces wouldn't last too long, against which the American Air Force might not last too long. The Europeans also would have to maneuver their troops into position. The Russians insist that they're not going to accept any European deployments into Ukraine, and the US aren't stupid enough to agree to back up the Europeans if they deploy themselves into Ukraine. The only way that Macron, this petty clown, can get his forces to march into Ukraine along with Keir Starmer's Christian soldiers is if somehow the Russian government was to agree to it. The Russian government can't agree to it, even if the sellout merchants in the Russian bourgeoisie desperately wanted to agree to it. The Russian population, has sacrificed too much and has seen too many men die for the Russian government to capitulate like that. The opposition to them in the form of the KPRF would immediately, I'm sure, denounce the Putin administration if it made such an act of absolute capitulation happen. So they're not going to get agreement from the Russians to deploy this force. It's just not going to happen. And they can't deploy it against Russian opposition. They know it. So it's all pathetic, limp dick waving from Macron. He's got nothing. They're talking about now, I mean, this is how utterly delusional the bourgeois press has become in France and in Britain, which is they're all screaming about how Keir Starmer is the new Churchill. Well, The Economist is screaming about that, and how we're going to lead Europe in defense itself without the Americans. This is an insane, raving mad, fantastical notion, because it's the product of minds that have divorced themselves from material reality. I mean, it's no wonder that none of these people could tell you what a woman was for years. But to look at Macron and Starmer thinking that they can recreate a defense industrial sector by in 3, 4, 5 years by raising like trillions through euro bonds and piling that onto the debt, all they're going to do if they go through with this is to guarantee that the euro will effectively implode. That is what they will guarantee. The euro only just survived the last Eurozone debt crisis a decade ago. It will not survive the piling on of €1 trillion in debt onto it. This is insane. The only reason that this elaborate dance is being done by Macron Starmer, Merz to a degree as well. We'll see where the Germans fall on this one, is to try and preserve the credibility of the Europeans and the European Union as an independent force in world affairs. What will be revealed, though, and again, whether Trump knows this is what he's doing or not, I'm not sure. Whether the Americans know this is what they're doing, I'm not sure. But what will be revealed via this switching tactics, where the US appears to pulls back to a certain extent from the getting into a toe-to-toe confrontation with the Russians, lets the Europeans do the heavy lifting, or says it's going to, is that the Europeans won't be able to do any heavy lifting. And I've said before that Macron, Starmer, and co. don't understand how their own systems work. They don't understand how they ended up deindustrialized, though admittedly France is in a slightly less bad position with regard to this than Britain is. They don't understand how they ended up with no industry. Not really. They don't understand how the fact it is all about the amount of profit you can make on employing labor that causes deindustrialization. It's part of what causes deindustrialization. When that amount of profit you can make goes down, this is when you start exporting capital elsewhere, and deindustrialization sets in, and the ruling class is seized by a mania and a belief that they can generate literally money out of nothing, which you can't do, not for too long anyway. And it's part of what leads the system to crash. And because the system's so rotten here, and the corporate structures leak money like a sieve, you have to pay astronomical amounts of money. The state does, to get the private sector to do anything. The only way you would get wholesale reindustrialization that Keir Starmer says he wants is if the state took direct control of it. What we'll get is a load of money being spent. It will all disappear into some shareholder's bank account. Very few jobs will be created. It will make bugger all difference to the fighting capacity of the British Army. More debt will be racked up, more services will be cut, taxes will be increased, and the legitimacy of the system continues to degrade. That's what will happen, because that's exactly what always happens, and what has happened repeatedly. Whenever there's some big announcement over, well, we're going to recreate this industry, we're going to recreate that industry, it just doesn't work, because the late stage imperialism is a phenomenally unproductive, very parasitic system, which absorbs money and pumps out nothing or very little. So we go back to Zauter's comment in the early part of the program, which is that you just don't get value for money when you pump it into these like European defense contractors. If you wanted value for money, you go to the Chinese. So if you wanted to efficiently re-equip an army, a navy, and an air force, you'd have to get China to build it for you. But for the Europeans, that isn't an option that's available to them. So what they'll try and do is they'll try and make industrial production profitable again by putting further downward pressure on the wages and living standards of the working class, which will generate more resistance, because the fantasy that the union leaders have in Britain and France and elsewhere, that there's going to be like loads of well-paid defense sector jobs coming down the pipeline. This again is a fantasy. It largely won't happen because, again, the companies aren't going to be wanting to pay the large salaries that will be required to employ the skilled workers that are needed to do these jobs. And there's a distinct lack of the kind of skill bases they require as well. So it's an expensive business that will all have to be underwritten by the state. Again, further plunging the state into a debt crisis, further plunging the euro, in the case of France, towards utter catastrophe. And this is where we are. This is why I call Macron a dreamer. It is the speech he gave the other day was an absolute, total, utter fantasy. That he will not be able to fulfill anything he talked about in there. But this is the latest fantasy from the man who fancies himself the savior of the Republic. All it will do is damn the EU and the euro and the EU along with it to utter ruin. And well, congratulations, Emmanuel. We welcome you to the accelerationist fold. But you see, the thing is, the more the ruling class try to get themselves out of the crisis that they have been in for a long time, the more contradictions are exposed. The more they try and strive to reassert themselves, the more impotent they look. The more they try to exert authority, the more repressive the state becomes, the more the legitimacy of the very state they're trying to reassert the authority of drains away. the more they try and reset the economy, the more the contradictions of imperialism are revealed. Of course, the people in charge don't understand this, which is why they're wildly thrashing around, thinking that they're going to somehow just be able to reset things by saying it very loudly and doing some aesthetic things to in what they think will be a revival. Won't happen. Now, talking about the bourgeois delusion, we turn, of course, now in conclusion to Mr. Trump. Now, Trump's speech was a fantastical series of assertions, which kind of reveals to you everything about the man. Trump is, of course, a brand guy. He's a guy who is a very modern politician in so many respects. He's very similar to Obama in that he makes announcements very loudly, asserts things, signs executive orders, makes a big show of X, Y, and Z, and only afterwards do you find out that not a lot changed. So he's making a big show of Doge, the agency that is apparently headed by Elon Musk. I don't think it is in reality. I think somebody else is responsible for it, and we'll find out who in due course. But what you see from Trump is a sort of attack of acute bourgeois idealism. There are, of course, not all the ideas in it are Trump's ideas. In fact, most of this would be, of course, written for him by somebody else or a series of other people. But what Trump is doing is expressing the point of view of a certain faction of the American ruling class. This is the faction that is possibly more interested in domestic production, that has traditionally been on the side of the Republicans, even though, of course, the big bourgeoisie, who are mostly invested in finance capital, are spread across both of the parties of the American oligarchy. But the domestic manufacturers have, typically speaking, been more aligned with the Republicans, which is why the Republicans are obsessed with deregulation, because the domestic manufacturers have convinced themselves and tried to convince everybody else that if it wasn't for these damn regulations, that America would still have a manufacturing base. If it wasn't for the regulations, if it wasn't for the damn Mexicans stealing the jobs, if it wasn't for the Chinese, we'd still have a manufacturing base. This is like the standard Trump message. Of course, they are suffering from the same delusions as Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, but they, of course, still have a slightly larger manufacturing base than Britain or France does. Trump's obsession with McKinley, whether it's his obsession, I think it's more likely something which has been sold to him by an advisor, is an obsession born out of an idea on in American right-wing circles, some of which you can find discussed online in these circles openly, that there was something went wrong with America when they took on these responsibilities of empire in World War One, and that prior to that, America had this growing, burgeoning industrial economy, freed from regulation, and all of the bureaucracy that followed the Woodrow Wilson era was pushing America towards stagnation and communism, etc., etc., etc. It's the kind of point of view you'd see expressed by like a Douglas McGregor or one of the other deluded ultra-reactionaries. Now, of course, what Trump is trying to put out there is his sales pitch is that if we can just deregulate enough, if we can just cut enough of the government, if we can get rid of those damn DEI programs, if we can do some eye-catching initiatives, we can say America's back. And the point of doing this is to try and revive. I think Trump does mean this in his own way. Revive domestic manufacturing. That's one of the big things he's always talking about. And of course, he's talking about tax cuts and deregulation and things like that to entice investment in manufacturing. Same tactics he used in his first term. None of it will work. For the same reasons it won't work in France and it won't work in Britain either. What you will end up with is very little being returned for what will end up being gigantic investments by the American federal government. And what you will end up with is a policy that ends up resembling strongly the Biden administration's policy, just as Biden followed on from Trump on a number of initiatives, which also produces as little as Biden's term in office did. because you'll end up with subsidies and tax cuts going straight into the bank accounts of leading corporations and the actual investment inside the United States being minimal. So I expect that within about 6 to 8 months, all the stuff that Trump's talking about in here will be revealed to be utterly hollow and utterly empty. And his administration will hit the buffers badly. It's already starting to get criticized more heavily because of the threats that Doge and whoever's behind it have been making to Social Security. If they go into like the next set of elections promising Medicaid or Medicare cuts or both, or a tax on Social Security, then that's a massive own goal, which they will suffer from. And they will revive the fortunes of the flagging and useless Democrats. I don't think they'll be quite that stupid, but the idea of like the rebirth of America is very much, again, he's taking a lot from the Reagan playbook, and he'll end up with roughly the same thing, which is that all the tax cuts and all the deregulation will just do, well, the same thing that it did in his first term, if Trump's lucky, which is juice the numbers on the stock market for a while, boost profits via financial engineering. I mean, for Christ's sake, he's hosting a crypto summit. I mean, that basically, like, what you are going to get is an explosion of the profits of scam artists, of companies that are, should we say, here today, gone tomorrow, because that's where the American economy has been led to. It's a speculators and spivs paradise, just like the British economy is. There is no plan for long-term investment, and there won't be either, not until the American worker is reduced to abject penury, which, again, if Trump tries that, you'll see an explosion of class struggle inside the United States itself. And so Trump is stuck, and he's engaging in all these delusions and all these rebranding attempts. He's boasting about the number of executive orders he's signed. What he's doing with his first few weeks in office is he's engaging on this sort of blitz of publicity and rebranding in the hope that this sort of works as partly on his electoral base as this selling this idea that America is being reborn out of the horrors of Bidenite socialism or whatever the fuck it is. And of course, none of it will work. And again, this will run aground in 6 to 8 months, and all the things he's talking about will not work. The peace settlement that he's talking about getting with the Russians will not work. Not only will the Ukrainians never agree to it, but there's a fair chance the Ukrainian state itself might collapse if Zelensky is forced out, because he is at the center of a series of networks which are held together essentially by bribes from the United States. And if the chief bribe taker is removed, there'll be a series of fights like rats in a sack over who gets the throne. If the Kiev regime is destabilized, and then he says adds to the military defeats being endured by the Ukrainians at the front, then there's a very real risk of total collapse. So there will be no deal between the Ukrainians and the Russians. There'll be no deal between the Americans and the Russians either. What you'll get is a slight normalization of relations, the restoration of diplomatic ties to sort of shave the edges off the confrontation that was developing. But the war will continue until it is settled in military terms by the Russians. The Europeans will try to keep the war going as a guerrilla war for a while, and maybe they'll even succeed at that for a little while. But there will be no peace. Trump's reindustrialization plan will not work. The money that he's lining up to spend on it, and the tax cuts that he's proposing, and the deregulation he's proposing, will only end up making life objectively worse for the American worker, even worse than it was under Biden, just as Biden made it even worse than it was under Trump, just as Obama made it even worse than it was under Bush, just as Bush made it even worse than it was under Clinton. The relentless class war upon the American worker will not stop until the American working class itself comes together, resists, and starts actually punching back at the ruling class in a serious way. Trump is just another scam artist, and he's always been a scam artist. He's been quite a successful one, trying to run a scam on the American population. His big announcements and his big flashy executive orders will run out of steam within about, again, 6 to 8 months. And then the reality of the Trump administration will be revealed, which is it's just another continuity American bourgeois administration. Right. So we are now looking at the chat for various contributions. I see there's been quite a few people getting in here. So going to go through some of these now. Okay. Just trying to find where we left things. Right. Okay. So we got 210 of you watching on Rumble, Locals, YouTube, Twitch, and I don't know the numbers on X. So if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to go and check that for a moment. Just hang on there. Right. Let's see. Where are we? Where are we? Where are we? Yeah, if you're on X, be sure to like and share the the broadcast. Always good to get that on the go. Where are we? Okay, so we've got 127 of you watching on X, and we got 210 of you watching on the other platforms. All good stuff. Be sure to like and share. Subscribe to the channel on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel on Rumble, Locals, and Twitch as well. You never know when YouTube's going to shut us out. So, Caustic Grip, you note that you say, I'm pretty sure Tusk believes he's going to fight Russia. It's in his eyes. Yeah, well, if Donald Tusk wants to go marching off to war against the Russians, I hope he leads the Polish Lancers himself. I'd love to see how he handles a horse. Right. Agricola Urbana says, also in general, €1 buys more in Russia or China compared to Europe because of the inner market circumstances. In general, corruption is, of course, a big part of it. Lucas says, do you think the ruling class are contemplating the idea of using unemployed workers when the crisis hits to recruit soldiers? Well, they may. I mean, they're still not. I mean, there's talk of conscription in places like Poland. Starmer's dancing around it here, but doesn't really dare go for it because the British ruling class traditionally hasn't liked it. They've done it, and when they've needed to, they did it in World War One, they did it in World War Two, but they did away with it in the end for a good reason, which is that they don't like hundreds of thousands of working class people trained in arms hanging around a decaying country and coming back to it feeling like they got royally fucked over, seeing a load of their friends get horribly killed and evaporated by the Russians, only to come home to find that the country's got worse in their absence and they are not treated like heroes. They are discarded, just the same way that British veterans have always been discarded. A bunch of armed men and maybe women coming back from that would be a problem for the British ruling class, which is why they don't like doing conscription. They may try limited conscription, but again, to come back to the point that I always make, they would still need to arm these men. They would still need to equip them. Like, they don't have the capacity to arm and equip them right now, nor will they for years to come. So, yeah, you can go ahead and conscript a load of guys. What are you going to arm them with? How are you going to clothe them? How are you going to feed them? Where are you going to train them? Now, you could revive some of that. There's disused military bases in this country, or only partially used military bases in this country. There's you could conceivably expand small arms production, but again, you'd need a reliable supply chain. You'd need to do things on a scale that the British ruling class hasn't done for over 30 years, and I don't think has much of an inclination to do it. I mean, the whole thing with the idea of the threat from the Russians is not a threat of the Russians rolling over Europe or even rolling over Poland. The threat from the Russians is nothing to do with that. It's a threat to the European order. And this, by the way, read Macron's speech. It reeks of like civilizational supremacism. It reeks of like good old-fashioned French racism. Yes, that's a smell that's quite distinctive and probably more pungent even than English racism, which is quite pungent in and of itself. The French do it in a certain different way. But all of this waffle that they come out with, it's really about them being exposed. All of this, in reality, is not about reestablishing or making war on the Russians. It's about making the rest of the world convinced that the European powers can still get it up, if I may be crude, that they're still powerful, that they're still to be feared, that you still have to take them seriously. That's what it's about. The threat from Russia is that they've exposed the Europeans and the US as not being able to fight wars. They've run the Ukraine war as an outsourced proxy affair. War being a continuation of policy by other means, to go back to Clausewitz. The policy in this case being outsourcing at all costs. So they outsource the war to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians do the dying. The Europeans and the Americans do the buying, and that has now been exposed as something which cannot win this war. And that's the threat that the Russians pose. It's nothing to do with them rolling over Europe and marching on Paris and hauling Macron back to Moscow in chains. Though that would be quite entertaining to see, or making the defeated European armies march through Moscow in the manner that they did the defeated Nazis. Again, that would be quite entertaining to see. Not going to happen, because they're not going to war with the Russians, because they would lose and lose incredibly badly. Doesn't matter how much conscription that they've done. They will be marching their men off, ill-equipped and untrained, barely trained, to fight an army that's now very highly trained in modern warfare. It would be a disaster. So they won't do it. This is all about convincing the rest of the world, particularly the African nations, the South American nations, the Southeast Asian nations, that Europe as an entity is still to be taken seriously. That's what this is really all about, and that Macron is the emperor. Of course, he's not, and none of this will work. Caustic Grip says, what's the situation with the Druze? Half of them seem to be pro-Israel, and the other half are totally against it. Yeah, it seems there's a split there. I don't know enough about it for now. I need to get more reading done on Syria before I can confidently say anything about that. Potted Rodent says, does Yanis claim to be a Marxist? I've never heard evidence of this. He claims to be an erratic Marxist in comparison to an erotic Marxist, which is something quite different again. That's what he described himself as for a while. He was, I think, involved in Trotskyite organizations back in the day, back when he was a student in Britain, I think. So he's claimed at various points that he's a Marxist, but he's a Marxist in the same way that, like, Tariq Ali is. He's a bourgeois intellectual who, like, plays with Marxism every now and again in a way that is acceptable to the ruling class. That's why Yanis still gets gets space in the Times, which is the paper of the British ruling class, the British political establishment, at least. You don't see any of my own comrades from the CPGBML being invited on the Times podcast. We don't get those invites, as far as I know. It's just simply a case of the ruling class knowing who's a threat and who's not. Right. Vera says, Yanis Varoufakis thinks the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration was an excellent idea and will pay off for the US. He's the only one saying this. Well, the only one other than Trump. I don't think it'll work. And I don't think Varoufakis actually understands modern capitalism. I mean, I really don't. I mean, it's why he babbles away about, like, techno-feudalism and other, like, fantastical notions, because fundamentally, I think he completely misunderstands modern capitalism. He doesn't understand Marxism either, because it is a revolutionary doctrine, and Yanis Varoufakis is not a revolutionary. But maybe we will go back to Varoufakis' theories. It might be something that's interesting to do in the future. Right. All right, here we go. Hello to Alexander Lukta, who's joined us. Even Sten says, how do the Communist Party of China can prevent the domestic bourgeois from interfering with government policies? Interesting question. My theory is that the continual purging of the state apparatus and party hierarchy in China is a lot to do with limiting the influence of the domestic bourgeois over the party and the state. It's called an anti-corruption drive, and certainly there's a lot of corruption purge, and there was, I think, things reached a dangerous point over a decade ago, just before Xi Jinping became the overall leader, became the general secretary and president. And I think they've been trying to balance things out and make up for lost time ever since then, and restore certain elements of proletarian rule that were lost or diminished in the Deng Xiaoping and Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao period. While, of course, always saying that if you read Xi Jinping's speeches, it's always and we honor, the Deng Xiaoping theory, and we honor the legacy of Yang Zemin, and we honor the legacy of scientific management introduced by Hu Jintao, etc., etc. But it's pretty clear that the Chinese party got to the point where it was threatened by comprador tendencies within the bourgeois of China. And the last 15 years now have been about the current leadership uprooting that and resetting things. And so far, they seem to have been quite successful at that. You can tell that they're confident because the Chinese Foreign Ministry made that very strong sounding statement the other day to Trump, said, well, if you want a trade war or any other kind of war, we're ready to fight it. And if the numbers given by our Zauter earlier are in any way accurate, that the Chinese can produce like 4 submarines in the time it takes the Americans to produce 1, or a record that's even better than that, you can see why they're confident. That's why Trump's raving away about rebuilding the shipyards. We used to build so many ships, great ships, wonderful ships, the best ships you've ever seen. Now we don't build any. What's going on? I read this guy Lenin. He said there was going to be like a collapse of the industrial base due to export of capital. I've decided to become a Marxist now. If only he had said that, that would have been hilarious. You see the look on Mike Johnson's face. David King says, when welfare gets cut for military spending across Europe, chaos will come in Europe. Yes, it will. Because the survivals of the only legitimacy that the system has at the moment is that it continues to provide certain things that were brought in to essentially buy off the working class after World War II, which is elements of welfare capitalism. Same is true in Germany, same is true in France. When that gets seriously put under threat, at that point, there will start to be massive revolts. Not saying for a moment that this automatically leads to socialism. That is a long and difficult fight. But you're seeing the mass outbreak of class struggle again. That will intensify when the ruling class inevitably launches a full-scale assault on what is left of the welfare capitalist period. And they are going to do that. They're going to do that quite soon. Abtin says, the last breath is the promise of a military career and government benefits. Isn't that where they're taking it now? They will probably try. They will probably try and link like access to like healthcare for you and your family to service in the military. That's a tactic that others have used. It's certainly a tactic the US ruling class uses. Whether they can do that or not is another question, because that depends upon them actually reviving the military. It depends upon them actually looking as if they're prepared to use it. It depends upon them reviving the industrial base. There's a lot of things they've got to do before they can even get to the point where they can try and cajole, coerce, bribe the working class to join. And I, in all honesty, don't think they're going to be able to get there. Agricola says, I remember in the 1990s when massive strikes of steel and coal workers happened, a social democrat stepped in front of 100,000 assembled workers and told them, go home, we heard you, we will take care. And they went home. Yeah, and that in essence sums up the entire curse upon the working class movement that social democracy has turned out to be. The curse is parliamentarism, parliamentary cretinism, reformism, a belief that if you just assemble a certain amount of people in a certain place, then somebody has to listen to you. I mean, God knows I've been to so many demonstrations in London where we assemble fucking hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million, and the ruling class goes like that. and everybody goes home and gets demoralized because there's too few people in this country or any other of the imperialist countries who have a conception of politics that goes beyond the bourgeois parliamentarism, or goes beyond the idea that, well, they have to listen to us now, right? Well, no, they don't. Why would they? You're still turning out and voting every 4 years and thinking that politics amounts to nothing but that. So why would they listen to you? Until you reach the point where you can threaten their power and their money and their property, they're not going to listen. And even when they do, they will listen and immediately mobilize their state forces against you. Again, I reiterate the point. There's no reforming this system. There is no reforming Britain or France or Germany or Italy or Spain or Portugal. These are dying systems. It's not necessarily the case that the peoples are finished, that the nations are finished. It's just that the systems that are currently constituted, the states as they are currently constituted, which are as capitalist states, are all finished, and the parasitic ruling class will literally drain the life out of all of these nations rather than give up control. Until more people, more workers realize that, then we're going to keep going around in this circle under the control of these utter wretched traitors, Khrushchevite revisionists, Trotskyites, and Social Democrats, all of whom just want to play their part in administering another defeat, shrugging their shoulders and saying, "Oh, it could have been worse, lads." That's why there's a feeling of suffocation and decay, because the forces that should be fighting are not fighting, and won't, because they have long ago been compromised and subverted. And again, until everybody realizes that, we will not go forward. Aberdeen says, if there is no alternative, the military path will be something many youths will be conned into. I do believe this. Yes, you're right, which is that there will be no alternatives available. My issue with that is that the ruling class may try and do that, but I don't think they're going to be particularly good at it, and I don't think they're going to be able to do it, because back in the day, you could make a career for yourself in the military, in the British military, in the colonial period, by going on colonial campaigns across the world. You're not going to be able to do that anymore. The effect of the Bolshevik Revolution is such to this day that the anti-colonial spirit remains. Like, you can go and try and dominate a country for a few years. You can invade it. You can steal its resources. You can try and set off sectarian wars to stop the population resisting you. But in the end, resistance returns, and you will ultimately be forced out. So that idea that you're going to gain military glory overseas isn't going to happen. What they'll be using the militaries for, in reality, is domestic repression. So you won't be getting the glory of a military career. You'll be being asked to open fire on your own class, your own friends, your own relations even. That's what the militaries will be asked to do. They won't be able to go to places and conquer them. The peoples of the world have moved beyond that now. They try and do it, it'll be an absolute disaster, and there'll be a domestic revolt. So what they'll end up doing is using the militaries to secure the rule of the parasitic bourgeoisie by engaging in more and more direct, armed, brutish repression against the domestic population, leading, of course, to more problems. My point here is that the ruling class can't solve one problem without opening up a whole load of others for themselves. If they believe that the time of conquest is re-emerging, then they are wrong. Again, the militaries will end up only being used against the domestic population, which will create even more problems for them. Many people might join up to some sort of revived British or Swedish or French military, believing they're going to go and get glory. Well, it's hard to sell that when the first job you're given is to go and repress a strike or a demonstration. Many will do it, of course. Many people will be lumpenized and be degenerated to the point where they think this is a good idea or just don't care. But it will eventually weigh on them. If the only thing an army is used to do is to repress, is to carry out internal repression, and it has no history of doing anything else anymore, then that will again cause a crisis of legitimacy for the system. Right, okay. Just going to scroll here to the end. Why does Zizek hate Russia? Zizek hates Russia because his career is based in the West, basically. Zizek's political pronunciations should be not taken seriously in the slightest. His political pronunciations have always been reactionary, have always been like dumb. And in actual fact, his political announcements kind of like go against much of what's in his own philosophical method. Like Zizek, again, his politics are absurd and it's foolish. But funnily enough, Zizek's the reason I started actually reading Stalin and Mao, because like I read all of his stuff like 15, 16 years ago. A lot of it I read the Parallax View. I read In Defense of Lost Causes. I read On Violence and a couple of other things as well. His Introduction to Lacan, which is actually pretty good. And his political announcements are nonsense, best ignored. His actual analysis of like Hegel and Lacan, his cultural commentary, and the way he uses Lacanian Hegelian concepts, that's all interesting. The political stuff, throw it out the fucking window. I mean, man's an idiot when it comes to the political stuff, and he more than that, man's a careerist. He wants the big gigs in the West, and you don't get the big gigs in the West if you say anything nice about the Russians. So you got to come up with a lot of old crap about the Western civilization, which, if you read his work, clearly he doesn't believe in. Clearly, if you read something like In Defense of Lost Causes, if you read On Violence, again, like whether he meant for this to happen or not, but loads of us when we were younger got into reading Zizek, and through that we got into reading Stalin. So he was a gateway drug into Stalin for us and into Mao. He just didn't know it, or maybe he did and didn't realize quite the extent to which his audience would follow through on the things that he was dancing around in his films. His films are still very funny, by the way. So, yeah, Zizek, political clown. Anything he says on politics should just be fucking discarded as evidence of like an old man trying to secure his career. But the other stuff, I think, is still worth reading. Alan Smith asks, couldn't the ruling class switch to a mercenary military? They could. It's a risk, though. Again, all of these things come with big risks, which is that a mercenary army is something which you can use. And again, the British have used them in the past. I believe the Venetians were particularly adept at using them for a while. But you can use a mercenary army to do domestic repression. But a mercenary army tends to quit on you before the bitter end. They tend not to be ideologically committed to the state structure they're defending. They're there for the paycheck. They can go and shoot a load of unarmed people in foreign parts, but engaging in the kind of like grinding war that often happens in the times of revolution, a lot of mercenaries won't be up for that action. A lot of them will quit. A lot of them will leave. So again, like, you can hire a mercenary army, you can try and wield it against your own population. But again, like if we're talking about state legitimacy, paying foreign mercenaries to gun down your own population doesn't look particularly good. And again, the state may get away with it, but again, it damages the legitimacy even further. And we are now in a terminal legitimacy crisis. Caustic Grip says his career was also funded by NGOs operating in Yugoslavia. Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, he was part of the anti-communist wave that came out of the Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. No doubt about that. That's why I say, like, read his political pronunciations with great caution at best, or just outright dismissal, because the man says all kinds of like stupid reactionary shit. It was still my gateway drug to Stalin, though. Okay. So we are going to leave it here for now. I thank everybody for tuning in for this evening. It took a few twists and turns. I'll be back with you with a late one tomorrow night because I am on the road most of tomorrow, but I will be back probably for a show at about 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. So I hope you can join me again for that one. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. We got 230 of you watching by the close of the broadcast, and we have 172 of you watching on X. Thank you to you all. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. Back with you again tomorrow, and we'll end things here for tonight. I hope you enjoy the weekend ahead of you.